Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
I'm a fan of classic movies.
Hello and welcome to Overlapping Dialogue, a podcast of double features dedicated to programming the finest, most eclectic, and downright bizarre film pairings, and cataloging the discussions that ensue. We're your gruesome twosome, Kyle and Levi Huffman. I'm Kyle.
I'm Levi.
And here we are. Spooktober Spooktacular is over, but don't worry. We're now moving on to Noirvember. Although next episode is not going to be noirs at all. But that's okay. Today, we're doing The Stranger from 1946 and The Lady from Shanghai from 1947. Two late 40s noirs from Mr. Orson Welles. One of the, preeminent names not only of classic Hollywood, but film in general. We've skirted around talking about Welles here or there, but here we are, going to kind of do two of his movies proper.
Yeah.
How you doing, Levi?
I'm all right. I'm actually happy that we're not doing Noirvember all November because
Levi's got a little bit of a. We talked about this, I think, maybe in the past.
Would just be
checkered history with noir.
Checkered history. That's funny. I would be like I would just be like Dennis Hopper in that one scene with Nicholas Ray in American Friend. I'm confused, because literally every noir is just like this happens, and then actually this was happening all along, and it's just like. I don't know. It's interesting to me. There's a whole kind of art form. I'm just going to call it an art form. Noir in itself is its own art form almost.
It's certainly its own medium
that just functions on in comic books or whatever. It just functions on a lack of sense in every way.
It was at that time a pretty surreal.
Yeah.
Which people might roll their eyes at this now in terms of it's very. What we imagine classic Hollywood to be, but it pushed the classic Hollywood style in a lot of ways, for better and for worse in some ways.
And noir ultimately is asking us to, I don't know where this comes from. I think partly the nicer version of it is to say that I think a lot of noir is wanting to replicate the feeling of confusion over what is mostly in these femme fatale stories, or as Nico once sung, "Got a femme fatale." Yeah. That's what she sounds like.
But not Nico Bellic, but
Nico Bellic. Imagine her reading Nico lines,
or Nico reading her lines too.
We're not even going to attempt that now. We'll do that later, off air.
But as you said, it's stylistically trying to represent that confusion, moral ambiguity
of like, am I in love with this woman, or should I put her away,
or maybe both,
or it's just the best possible cinematic exemplification of what it's like to be drunk as hell all the time as an alcoholic. I'm not really sure which it is. It could be both.
Well, I think, I'm more of a fan of noir than Levi is, generally speaking. But the more, and I know you would agree with this too, the more of them you watch, the more you realize that noir is not just always the detective story. I feel like that's the stereotype.
No, because The Stranger is one of the best, we'll go ahead and say, because it actually is a story that makes sense. It's a lot like Notorious in that way, that also being kind of a noir. A World War II noir. But
I think when people think of noir, even people that aren't super familiar with it as a genre or as a medium, they think of like The Maltese Falcon or The Big Sleep, which are both movies that I quite like, especially The Big Sleep. But are detective-driven stories. They have the femme fatale. They maybe have a MacGuffin. are black and white. Of course, like most movies of classic Hollywood era in the 40s, have this cynicism about themselves. I mean, I think, most people would think of Humphrey Bogart as almost a prototypical noir actor, and he definitely came along at a time where... Also, they're more, early on, they were more complicated gangster movies. They came from that tradition. Obviously, they're much more plot-heavy than those are. And that's another thing, too, as you were hinting at, is that the plots in many of these movies are very all over the place, very chaotic, and definitely Lady from Shanghai, I think. But it's still quite good, but it's an exemplification of that.
Of the two, it's more of that. Yeah, it's a more basic noir in that way. I want to speak briefly, though, about... I didn't think we were going to talk this much about noir or so early on, in the context of noir itself.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about that before. But The Big Sleep is a movie that I want to see it again, but I don't get as much as other people do, because I watch that, and I'm like, I literally have no clue what's going on at all. Because when I watch... Now, as much as I love style in movies and mood and atmosphere, I am a very plot-oriented person.
Maybe even story, I think, would be another way to phrase that.
Yeah. But I want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
I don't like walking out of a movie and coming back in and being like, oh, what's going on now? Like,
unless it's like much more like implicitly surreal or abstract.
Yeah.
But a movie like that is also a classic Hollywood movie, so above all else, it's trying to and supposed to tell a story as the primary goal.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, Raymond Chandler, for example, who I know who wrote the novel and then worked partially on the movie. Who all was it that worked on that movie? It's like kind of a murderer's row of people, I remember, and they turned in that kind of work.
Faulkner, was he a name?
That's what I was going to say. So imagine him writing his like stream of consciousness, and then they're all like, I don't know, Faulkner, Lee Brackett, and Jules Furman, who are all like really big names of screenwriters, especially Lee Brackett, also,
who later wrote early draft of The Empire Strikes Back, which is
wrote Rio Bravo and The Long Goodbye.
A lot of huge movies.
Yeah, and so I don't know. It's like I don't want to just rip that movie for no reason, but now that you brought it up, because I've seen it the once, and it's a Howard Hawks movie. Of course, it's going to be well made, and it's got Bogart and Bacall in it, so it's great in that way. But I don't know, you look at that list of screenwriters, and you see Chandler's name there too, and you're like, oh, okay, so what was any of that? Yeah. Nobody knew. It's like, I think Raymond Chandler was once asked by them, who did this? He said, oh, I don't know. And it's like, what do you mean you don't know? You wrote the book.
Yeah.
And it's just this, I don't know. A lot of noir to me is an allowance and an apology for people to just be alcoholic hack storytellers. I'm sorry, that's just what it is. It's like, oh, it's not about that. Well, what the hell is it about then?
I would mostly agree with your rolling your eyes at that. I think for me, one reason I really love The Big Sleep is just the execution of style is so brilliant. And that was directed by, of course, Howard Hawks, who did some better movies, by the way, than just that. To me,
Only Angels Have Wings, just for one, which came out around the same time.
Two of my favorite noirs are Key Largo and White Heat. And what I love about both those movies are they're basically kind of sort of, White Heat even more explicitly, the gangster movie, but with like in a noir set, like in a more noir world. And that might seem like, well, it's kind of the same thing, right? But there's a level of moral complication that noir brings that I really love. And they're also very simplistic stories in a good way, right? I mean, Key Largo is like, we're all stuck in this one place. There's a gangster here. He's messing it up. White Heat is the gangster's getting ready to go down. You know what I mean? I think noir usually works best, and I think this is why The Stranger is one of the better noirs, when it's like, it's got that atmosphere, but it also has a fairly simplistic
like
story
Detour
that you can hang it. Oh, Detour is one of the
best.
best.
That's like the best, I think, of them all, probably.
But like, I love Key Largo and White Heat because they also get to be A++ performance pieces for their leads. Of course, James Cagney in White Heat and Humphrey Bogart in Key Largo. And they both, Key Largo, he was like a war veteran, and so there's that post-World War II vibe to it.
That was in the late 40s, right?
Yeah, I think that was 48, so it was a little after that. I do think Detour is one of the best, and I'll see what you think of this, and you're one of the biggest Vertigo fans ever, I know, but I think Vertigo, to me, is the logical end of noir in terms of the original slate of movies, and that movie's so brilliant, and it's not just a noir, but I feel like it's the greatest noir of all, because also a fairly simplistic story. Now, there are some plot dynamics that you have to follow throughout, but the more you watch it, the more you fall under the spell of the movie and are not caught up when the MacGuffin or the detective aspects of it. Obviously, Hitchcock thrived in making, but he's also such a huge director. I think sometimes his work is seen outside of noir, but in many ways he was making noirs throughout that same period, and some more explicitly than others. But how do you categorize Vertigo as a noir or in relation to noir?
It is, and I think why it's the best noir, and I don't normally think of it as that, although it is, that's another thing, is that movie does everything it can to fool you into thinking it's not a noir, it's in color. Not that noirs can't be in color, but especially at that time. But
mostly they were black and white.
They were black, because they thrive on black and white. That's the whole thing. Is in color. It's also kind of maybe a horror or thriller, depending on, she's really possessed by a ghost, which, spoiler if you don't know, is not true.
Yeah. But it plays with that tension throughout.
Yeah. But what works so well about it, like I said, it has a plot that is easy to follow, but then it does, not even, just a little over halfway through the movie, like 2/3, tells you, this is actually what happened. But that's not really important. Now what's important is, how far is this man going to take this obsession? How far is this woman going to allow him to take this obsession? How obsessed is she with him? And that's the whole point of the movie. And that's what every noir ever has tried to do. But Hitchcock was lucky enough and fortunate enough to come at the end of all of that and say, okay, let me now do what we've all been spinning our wheels doing for like 30 years at this point.
And I think, too, I think, like, as far as classic noirs go, in terms of being more noir-ish explicitly, I think Double Indemnity is quite strong, and I think that deserves its place towards the top of the pantheon of noir.
Even as more of a kind of, like, person about Billy Wilder, I think that is really good. Let me just look at another list here. Now, there's a lot of these I still want to see, like DOA. I quite like The Big Heat. I thought that was really good. But that's also because it's got Glenn Ford and it's a Fritz Lang movie, so it's automatically going to have this, like, propulsion and this anger. That's one of just the meanest movies I've ever seen. It's just so, like, wow. But, Detour obviously mentions one of the best. And then, of course, there's other countries have done versions of noir, and even Breathless is a version of that in its own way. But... yeah, we've now lived in a deeper era of neo-noir than we have even noir. Yeah, we've talked about Basic Instinct and James Ellroy being a version of that now.
Yeah.
Say Fight Club is a version of that. Lost Highway, that's a great one.
I never even thought of Fight Club as one, but it is actually neo-noir.
Big Lebowski, which is also in the Long Goodbye. I think we talked about Body Heat in the past on here, I think, too. And Trouble in Mind, that's great. So we could go on and on and on. But there are great versions of that, but to me, and of course, In a Lonely Place, that's got to be, like, in the top three. Yeah.
But wouldn't you agree? I think a lot of the best noirs, when I think of them, when I think of Vertigo, when I think of The Stranger, when I think of Detour, White Heat, Key Largo, some of those movies, that the most fascinating thing about all those noirs are, like, the simplicity of the story on top of the performance, on top of the atmosphere.
Right.
Mildred Pierce also is debatably a noir, depending on how you want to categorize it. And that there might be mysteries abound, but they're not the most plot heavy, things.
Right. Kiss Me Deadly is another one.
Yeah.
That's really good. And then Touch of Evil. Of course, we'll talk more about Touch of Evil here in a little bit when we get back to that. But, that's just to say, I think that these movies, to me, represent noir at its best, and not noir at its worst, but at its most, like, okay, yeah.
Well, especially Stranger, Lady from Shanghai, excuse
that's
me.
what I'm saying.
I think, one of the classic noirs in terms of highs and lows, and again, overall, it's a well-executed version. But before we get into those movies specifically, we got to get into a fairly quick, but nonetheless delicious Blue Plate special.
Hi, Audrey. Norma, have a cup of coffee, please. Sure.
I'll have what she's having.
Hey, who wanted a large pepperoni? Coming up!
Your next and unwanted Planet of the Apes is Rain Here.
Doesn't it feel like a throwback to be talking about Planet of the Apes?
Yeah,
on
it
here
does.
Again?
It's funny because I was just thinking, I was like, I'd like to watch through those again. And I was like, didn't we just do that?
It's
been
back
like
in
2
the
years
golden
ago.
age of 2021.
Yeah, that's been
now.
like 2 years, but yeah.
So,
yeah, I don't want to sound too negative up front by saying nobody wants it, because clearly everybody does. But it also, to me, doesn't feel like it's been that terribly long since War for the Planet of the Apes. Maybe
When
that's
did that
just
come
me.
out again? What year?
2017. It's been a while, but that doesn't feel that long ago.
That'll be
to me.
7 years, I guess,
Yeah.
between that and when the new one
I guess
comes
because
out.
COVID kind of sped up time, and it's kind of we've been in this limbo. But like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So there's a new trailer recently released. Say that 5 times fast. For
Recently
Kingdom.
released, yeah.
Yeah.
Dang it! I was gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna dunk on you, and then yeah.
Kingdom of
I
the
will be
Planet
no
of the Apes.
Ben Wimbignana, or whatever, how you say his name.
The
sorry.
guy for the Spurs
Yeah.
now. Kingdom.
Wimby, as they call
Yeah.
him.
It
I'll
always-
pay you
like-
for a basketball today. Oh, that's Wimpy. Sorry.
Kingdom
Anyway.
of the Planet of the Apes. I think we did mention this on the horizon when we were at the end of.
Yeah, we talked about the fact that Wes Ball is going to make one.
So Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. The trailer just got released. It's going to be
for
coming
immediate
out
release
next summer. I think in May.
For immediate release.
In
Right.
2024. Sure. Yes.
When you say sure, like, is it or is it not?
I mean, we'll see. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes.
Wi-Fi's not working.
Yeah, but that's all right. The apes are in control.
Well, I wish they were.
We're not one to break down trailers in depth, and don't expect that
'cause,
here.
Yeah. Just read the premise, maybe. Here first.
Yeah, let's see. The premise: generations after the events of War of the Planet of the Apes, many ape clans have emerged in the oasis to which Caesar led his fellow apes, while humans have regressed into a feral state. When the ape leader Proximus Caesar perverts the teachings of Caesar to enslave other clans in search of the last traces of a secret human technology, ape Noah embarks on a journey to find freedom alongside a young human woman named May. Interestingly enough, also, like, practically all of these actors who are going to be obviously mocapped to look like apes, not really, I don't really know any of them.
Is Andy Serkis not one of them?
He's
Wow.
not on here.
That's big.
I mean, he was Caesar, so I guess
Yeah.
he's dead now. So
Well, but still, I mean.
yeah, William H. Macy. He might be one of the main few humans in the movie. I'm not sure. Again, judging by the film Twitter reaction to this, which is a specific community, I'm not going to say that's a representation of what everybody thinks, but was pretty positive, or at least, let's have more apes movies. And, I think obviously we're going to see it and we're going to have an opinion on it. And we'll probably one day be doing a commentary
When
of
the
it
Blu-ray comes out,
to go into, we'll have the
to
old
get
theme.
into that blue plate special.
Hi, Audrey. Norma, have a cup of coffee, please. Sure.
Anyway, just to reintroduce that. This second part of the blue plate special is Rain Here. All right, continue anyway.
Again, I thought it looked fine.
Yeah.
It's one of those things visually, of course, it looks fantastic.
Yeah.
It does get to the heart of part of my thing with the newer movies that we talked about way back when is I kind of miss the dressing up in apes. I get it. It's not realistic.
Yeah.
Whole thing's a friggin' sci-fi parable anyways. It ain't going.
Well, I know you know this, and I'm not saying you're wrong. You know this. I know I'm not saying you're wrong, but I mean, it's obvious that's never going to happen again.
Oh,
so
yeah,
it's like,
I know that,
I'm just saying. So that's one of those things I don't even.
And I guess
think
one could
about,
just say, well, we already got all that, and so let's move on. And there's a point to which I actually respect that idea.
But and one of the few positive things we had to say about the Tim Burton remake was how good that looked.
Yeah,
because you'd even think by 2000s era, 2001, you would think even by then that it'd be like, Yeah, that don't look that good. But now, even still, it's like, oh wow, that.
I remember
really
in that
good,
episode
like,
we really ripped Mark Wahlberg a new one. I remember the whole intro.
Oh yeah, well yeah, cause we talked about that
I forgot
forever.
about that until now.
Yeah, but well, I mean, he's a scumbag, so it's like whatever.
I will say I like that this is moving in the direction of like, oh, guess what? All these apes aren't going to get along.
Yeah,
because I feel like sometimes I listen to the fans of the newest movies, like delighting, let the apes get the humans. It's like, oh, so you think they're all just going to get along? I mean, I think the whole point in the arc of this ultimately is probably going to be they're going to replicate many of humanity's mistakes in terms of their own civilization.
There were versions of that. There
civilization.
were versions of that with the rocket in those newer ones. But I feel like they did versions of that too in the original movies. But I feel like we've never really gotten a good version of that.
If you think about even the originals, they were like apes versus humans, and so hopefully this can be ape on ape with the third element of the humans returning, and we're probably going to have a version of Taylor and astronauts coming back from space. A version of replicating what the original movies had. So. And that way,
I'll say this about that trailer. I like that they were straight up speaking English. It wasn't like, it was like, a beautiful day, or whatever that one said. I thought was funny. It's like, I want more of that. I want them just speaking English at this point because it's.
Or whatever language it gets dubbed in, whatever, Yeah.
Right. Because it's like, enough of that. They need to be talking like.
And so,
like people.
If the arc of these new movies is that they're going to replicate humanity's mistakes and then also face off against humanity, but also themselves, I actually think that's a promising.
Yeah, I'll say this:
thing,
seeing the trailer, I just saw the trailer for the first time like 5 minutes ago, or when right before, and I was impressed by like, oh, this actually looks fine enough, like because I have no faith in it to the point where it'll probably be all right. But this is also coming off the fact that we've lost Matt Reeves; he's not making it now. And it looked really good, I'll say, as far as the way it looked, but you can tell Matt Reeves ain't making this, so.
I will say, I do like that it's a little brighter.
I was going to say that. One thing about Matt Reeves' movies, they were a little bit too dark, so I do like this, that it's brighter and sunnier. We just need more color in movies anyway.
Especially in blockbusters. Yeah.
Right, so.
I think that's one thing, honestly, that Barbie was. One of the reasons it was a success above it being this brand,
and that's I think why people love that.
People want to see more colorful movies. I mean, and
that's why people love Avatar so much too, because those are like. I mean, it's very monochromatic.
I did actually think about this as being partially inspired by Avatar as well, as on a visual level, which I think is a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing, but so I'm actually like cautiously optimistic. I think if because. This goes back to one of my central problems with what I quite like the new trilogy overall. If it's this human versus ape thing, and naturally so much of the audience, just because of their own contempt for humanity, are going to naturally side with the apes, that actually makes it a very simplistic conflict that I hope these movies moving forward ratchet up and make more complicated, because I think the more you make that complicated, the better. Because if it's just humans versus apes, we've already seen this so many times, and so give me something.
And there's
new
part,
and different.
and this is gonna sound like, oh, you're just pulling for the bad guy, but in a lot of these movies, there's stuff where the apes are like raiding and killing people, where I'm kind of like feel like, this is like I want to see the humans do better than that. You know what I mean? And it's like. Not that I don't divorce myself from being a human being, and because I mean that's the point of these movies, is we're supposed to identify more with the apes than the humans. But there are times where I'm like, I want to like I feel, and I think this is a positive thing towards the movie. I feel kind of violated by watching apes kill human beings, like
I do too.
And I think that's a natural thing that a lot of people who watch these movies don't even admit to.
Yeah.
But I like the feeling of that though, in the sense of like it puts me in this place that makes me feel weird about that.
And I do think these movies try to make statements about humanity versus nature, meaning humans versus not only apes but nature in general as a climate change allegory, which is certainly a context that would not have been in the 60s and 70s as much as a newer take on it. But ultimately, sci-fi, on a fundamental level, I don't care if you're with aliens, I don't care if you're with apes or whatever, is about human conflict, anthropomorphizing real human concerns and real human divides. And I think sometimes these movies, by making these digital apes that look like real apes, they make people forget or not understand or themselves get trapped into it being this man versus nature conflict that to me is not as interesting as replicating a human versus human.
Because animal conflicts are literally one note basic: survive, and that's literally all it is, and procreate. Yeah. And so all the conflicts that come as a result of that are literally just besting each other in violence, and that's literally all it is. And so, and I think a lot of people want to boil human beings down to that too. But there's a lot more to it than that, and so I agree. I think that people forget that with these, and they want to make it very man versus nature centric, which is good that these movies are doing that, because that's the concern now, not as much nuclear war or something that I wish they would return to more, which is the racism allegory of these, which I feel like they sometimes hit on, but
obviously
not
back in the 70s it was a more omnipresent even than it is now. Certainly because the newer movies are not oriented in that fashion. It's more about this more natural divide.
But to act like that's not still a concern is its own problem too, is what I'm saying. But I don't know. But it looks alright. I mean, of course I'm going to want to go see a Planet of the Apes movie over anything else, so it's like cool. I think it's also just because people are wanting, and this is, maybe you want to talk about this too as another Blue Plate special thing, I don't know, but about the whole, I've been kind of confused about this, maybe you can explain it, this whole Marvel news this week about Marvel basically being in shambles. Can you shed some light on that to me, because I never did figure this out. I didn't look enough into it.
So I mean, the last so many, and this almost seems like it's in preparation for the flop of Marvels or the Marvels or whatever is getting ready to come out. When I say out loud Captain Marvel, I'm thinking of what is now called Shazam.
3 different Captain Marvels who live in these different universes that go,
So I think honestly that they were trying to get ahead of this. I don't remember if it was Variety or Hollywood Reporter did a big cover story. I can't remember who it was. One of the
I think it was Variety. I'm
might
pretty
have
sure.
been Variety.
Yeah.
Did this big cover story about how Marvel has a lot of problems right now because they seem as though they're primarily a TV franchise, and the movies have underperformed really since Endgame in a roundabout way.
And that's happened to Star Wars too, obviously, because Star Wars has literally disappeared from the movie theater industry totally.
So much so that they've even apparently approached Robert Downey Jr. to come back as Iron Man, and that's a conversation that's being had, as well as Scarlett Johansson to come back from Black Widow. Both of them died in the recent Marvel
I didn't know
movies.
that Black Widow was dead. That shows you how much I don't pay attention.
Was that in the Endgame or the one before that? I can't even remember.
Well,
now.
she had that Black Widow movie she was in.
Well, that was a prequel.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That was like a prequel.
Oh, I guess she did die then. Literally, see, I have no clue.
Yeah.
See, because that's the problem. Like, these movies try to, and I'm going to bring it up again, these movies try to become Heaven's Gate and have all these characters and all these things going on. It's like, but when you don't care about any of them, you're not going to remember who lives and who dies. It just really doesn't matter to you. Like, of course, I remember that Iron Man died because he's Iron Man, I guess, and Robert Downey Jr., whatever he's in, is going to make himself the center of attention, which is for good and for ill, I think.
I mean, we can't underrate him in Oppenheimer.
Right, no, that's great.
Of that.
So, yeah, like,
and that was honestly nice. Oh, you can act in a real movie again. Like,
I mean, the man who moved the earth.
Yeah.
But, no,
I mean, even that, ironically, even his character in that is about, I'm going to be the center of attention.
Right,
put this person off, and be ruined as a result.
And then the great twist is, they didn't think about you at all.
Yeah.
But anyway, just to say that, that goes to show I literally have no clue, because these movies try to make themselves too big and too operatic to the point where it all breaks down narrative and character-wise. I just don't care. No. So anyway, but they're trying to bring these people back because they know that nobody cares.
That is what's fascinating about Planet of the Apes, is that while Caesar was a, quote, character in these movies, there are certain kind of character types that get recycled and a new version of. But on the whole, the appeal of the Planet of the Apes series are apes versus humans. That's just like, and some people are like, oh, I don't even need to have seen all of them. And it's not, I mean, there is a continuity, but it's not as heavy-handed as like the Marvel Cinematic Universe is.
Literally, you
Star
could watch any one of those new 3 and it wouldn't matter. Like,
Also, like, just to, as you said earlier about Marvel's in shambles and Star Wars, what's next? It's like, these are the futures that Disney created for themselves.
Yeah.
Like, why are we at all surprised? Disney put in motion that we're going to make you be tired of these things by just producing them so much to the point where it's like, and then
Indiana Jones is dead in the water no matter what happens because that didn't make money, and also, well, no one expected that to go anywhere either because it's like, oh, they bought it with Lucasfilm and it's just been kind of sitting there. But then to do it and then know that, okay, this is the last Harrison Ford one for realsies this time. But then, nobody's going to go out and see a Phoebe Waller-Bridge Indiana Jones movie. That's just not going to happen. So, they really shot themselves in the foot with this whole Disney Plus thing.
Other than Oppenheimer and Barbie, there were no huge winners of the box office this summer, especially.
Right.
So,
well, especially coming off of what a big, massive success, obviously, the Avatar Way of Water was. And you can see that there are these franchises that, believe it or not, people are still interested and want to go care about because they don't make them every 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's another thing about Avatar. I mean, we waited... what was it?
12 years.
12 years.
No, 13
years between them. And again, we're not like huge Avatar fanboys or anything, but like we like the first movie.
And I would say I am a relatively huge enough James Cameron fan to where that's going to be a part of that.
And so, just less is more. It's just like, do not keep making the.
It's funny to say with Avatar 2, less is more, but I know what you mean. To make less movies, right? Yeah.
And there were a lot of people that were scratching their heads like, who's going to care about this? Well, it turns out a lot of people cared when it came out.
I've said this on this podcast multiple times. I don't think, and I think you know this, but I don't think that cinephiles know how big that first Avatar movie is for most average people.
Yeah.
That's like their thing. No, like when I decided, I'm going to show Avatar during lunch during my first year when we were watching movies every day during lunch, you wouldn't believe how many kids were like, yes, Avatar, yeah. And like had seen it way more times than me. And I had, as a cinephile, I'd only seen it like twice, I think, before that. And all the people that I talked to randomly about a year ago that were like, oh yeah, I'm going to see Avatar 2, yeah. And like, that is a bit and you saw the returns.
Mm-hmm.
Now because a lot of people I think for a long time like to inflate the Avatar box office by saying China and 3D, but I don't think that accounts for the amount of people that went to go see Avatar. Like, you don't just make money off of those two things all on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So all that together with that, the Avatar movies
at the holiday season,
yes, are massively big for the average people that go to the movie 2 or 3 times a year.
I think too, the simplicity of the premise and the idea. A lot of people feel like, I don't gotta watch a billion things to be caught up on it. I can see the first movie and then I'm good to go in. You know what I mean? It's like that.
And those are not short movies either. They're both 3 hours long.
Yeah.
I mean, so
And I don't know. And I think another thing too, people unconsciously are like, this isn't a movie made by committee. James Cameron is one of the few, like, I put auteur with him in slack quotes, but few creative minds in Hollywood that is like, he's making all the decisions. Everything's going to be his decision. It's not going to be something that, and I'm not even trying to diss Kathleen Kennedy because she's got a great resume overall, but like, it's not like Kathleen Kennedy telling Ryan Johnson or telling Phil Lord and Chris Miller this or like Kevin Feige. No, it's James Cameron. John Landau's there, but it's a James Cameron movie. James Cameron's making all the decisions.
It's a Lightstorm production,
And so, again, I think the simplicity of it is, again, less is more. I mean,
and so,
as you said, it is kind of funny to all the resources that go into those movies.
No, but I know what you mean.
More, but like, in terms of just narrative,
and he took
he's
his
got
time.
a certain genius when it comes to narrative. We've talked about Titanic ad nauseum on this podcast and had a whole podcast about it. Funny enough, it was mentioned in our preacher sermon today, so we thinking about it. But the simplicity of that story amidst the spectacle.
And
it's what people want from.
And it was able to tell the
like
story
that.
of the Gilded Age and robber baron Europe and America and industrialism,
and then also the end of the 20th century at that point, when it was made,
pre-World War I, imperialism, just a lot of ideas, and then but it's a love story about one of the biggest tragedies in world history of this massive
that was already a big
like,
deal, but now for future generations, that movie will definitively define the cultural memory of that.
And although it has people that are made up, is about as good as you can get of a historical version of that on screen. I mean, it's pretty direct.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's all. Also to say that people want to see things like this, and I'll say too, but at the same time they don't, because I got into a minor Twitter spat with someone I don't even know back about a week ago. They had tweeted about how many younger people were going to see Killers of the Flower Moon, and I said something like, well, I think that like the percentage of people going to see it, I guess is what I mean. And I kind of said, well, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I basically like, well, I think that's kind of a generalization, because we all know good and well that most young people are not going to go see Killers of the Flower Moon. Let's just get that out of the way. And most older people aren't either. And I said,
and since box office overall has not been all that great, but I mean, again, that box office was just kind of a bonus for Apple, who knew that what they were funding, and that it was.
I think it passed 100 million this week. Is that right?
I can't remember what it was.
Which was a surprise to me. It made that much money. But I mean, like, and that's not to say that people aren't going to see it, but it's
made
like,
over $100 million.
Yeah, but I'm just like, no, that's not really an accurate assumption because they said the same thing about Oppenheimer too, that, all the young people came out to see that. Well, that was also because they went out to see Barbie. So it's like, and it was a meme. So it's like they want to keep acting like, young people want to go to the movies. Like, I don't think that's totally an accurate.
Well, it's people who are around young people a lot.
Right.
I think
that's
we
what I'm
best
saying.
agree that that's not.
And I mentioned, I teach middle schoolers, and they're like, well, we're not talking about the person who replied back, we're not talking about middle schoolers. Yeah. We're talking about. And I'm like,
are they referring to like people in their late teens, early 20s?
Yeah.
Is
and
what
I'm like,
talking about?
No. But I was like, no, idiot. I said it nicer than this. I said, you are correct that I am not discussing that, or that is not what's being discussed. I was like, but that's the future of what those people are going to be. Mm-hmm. And it ain't that different from what it was when they were kids, which was only about 5-10 years ago. So, that whole assumption is just really flawed and stupid. Like, most people are not going out to movies to care. But it has been seen very clearly that these movies like Flash, I'm not even going to count Indiana Jones because that's so outside of anything of just why was that even made. But Flash and the Marvels movies and the Marvels and Marvel movies in general, and basically Star Wars not existing in like I said, a multiplex space, that it's shown that people are just getting tired of that, and then these other things they're more interested in. So because I mean, another really big, I don't even know how much it actually made. I have to go back and look and see where it is on the list. But I mean, a movie like Cocaine Bear, for example, made a lot of money at the beginning of the year. You know why? Because it was a dumb little old bear on cocaine movie, and people want to go see that. Like, it's not that complicated to figure out what people want to go see.
Yeah.
But they act like it is. They think it is, and then they get twisted in these knots about that to the point where then nobody's making money anywhere because nothing's getting made. So, and nothing literally is getting made right now. And that's another thing that's interesting too, is the way that people have acted about Dune, which I'm a massive fan of, as we all know. But everybody's acting about that second one like, oh my God, we've been cheated out of that. And it's like, nobody is going to go see that movie. It's going to make no money.
Yeah.
And the fact that everybody's thinking that Dune Messiah is going to be even made at all is hilarious. I just think that. And I'm not saying all this with any glee or happiness. Of course I would rather that happen than not. But that's just literally the unreality someone has to live in to believe that a movie that barely made its money in the first place, was even a question over whether a second one was going to be made, is then, after these massively long strikes, which has been pushed back 3 or 4 times, going to make any sort of money that would lead anyone to believe that any more of those movies are going to get made, is smoking crack like they're crazy. That just is nuts to me. So I'm just saying that now, and when I'm wrong, we can all come back and we'll replay this moment for posterity.
Yeah.
But that's just crazy town, if anybody thinks that that's going to happen. So that is also to speak to the sadness of, that movies like this aren't getting made that much, and the fact that even something as halfway maybe good looking as Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is even, people are like, oh, whoa, look at that. Like, when like a million of those movies have been made too. And so, yeah, I don't know. And the fact that we're surprised that that original Dune didn't make money, it's literally a movie version of Dune. Like, why would most people go see that? Like, it was literally described by a student I had as, boring Star Wars. So, and I'm like, yeah, basically. Not that I agree with that, but I think that's a pretty good perception of what most people think that is. But you know,
anyway, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes will come out next summer, and again, we'll probably have takes on it when it comes out, and then we'll definitely be doing a commentary to add it to our Planet of the Apes series. But we got to go back in time, 1946. Here's the trailer for The Stranger.
In failing to speak, you become a part of the crime.
But I'm already a part of it. Because I'm a part of you.
Gee, Mr. Wilson, you must be wrong. Mary wouldn't fall in love with that kind of a man.
Well, I hope I am wrong, Noah, but that's the way it is. People can't help who they fall in love with.
What do you want?
I came to kill you.
You are a fool.
When they find me, they'll know you're still here.
But darling, you're on the verge of a breakdown. Any child could see you'd wind up killing yourself.
Kill me, I want it. I couldn't face life knowing what I've been to you and what I've done to Noah. But when you kill me, don't touch me with your hand.
Now I'm just imagining Edward G. Robinson saying, "We have to go back. We have to go back."
Yeah.
How would Orson Welles say that? His blood will be on your hands.
Blood will be on your hands.
Anyway, yeah. So The Stranger is a 1946 American thriller film noir, directed and co-written by Orson Welles, starring Edward G. Robinson, Loretta Young, and Orson Welles. It's Welles' third completed feature film as director and his first film noir. I'd thought there was a movie in there in between Magnificent Ambersons and this. So that's surprising to me. It's not.
Yeah.
It centers on a war crimes investigator tracking a high-ranking Nazi fugitive to a Connecticut town. It's the first Hollywood film to present documentary footage of the Holocaust. It actually, randomly, another important thing, it entered the public domain. So it's actually randomly a public domain movie. One of the better films in the public domain, probably. When its copyright was not renewed. So basically, this is about Edward G. Robinson is like I said, a war crimes investigator. He's literally only known as Mr. Wilson in the movie. He never has a first name.
Yeah.
Searching for this Nazi fugitive called Franz Kindler, who was actually one of the primary kind of instigators and masterminds of the Holocaust. And that he is hiding somewhere in the world. They're not really sure where. And that they are able to track him to a small town in Connecticut where he is basically acting like he is this history professor named Charles Rankin at this prep school. So actually it's kind of more of a like a high school. It's only. And that he goes there to find him, and at first they're not totally sure if it is him or not, but that ultimately it proves to be. And then that's what I thought most of the movie would be about. But actually, about halfway through, it's all basically figured out by the powers that be that he is who he says he is, or he is not who he says he is. But then the whole movie becomes about, very surprisingly to me, Loretta Young as his wife, newlywed wife, grappling with the fact that he may or may not be a Nazi, and leading to her overall denial of this fact for the majority of the time, and then the movie becomes about totally other things that I found even more fascinating than the rest of the movie, which was good, but I was glad that it turned into those things instead, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Do you want to go through the cast?
Yeah, we can do that
quickly.
Pretty quick, yeah.
Okay, so obviously Orson Welles as Franz Kindler / Professor Charles Rankin. We've talked about him a lot as a director, and we can talk about that throughout both these movies, but what's your perception of him as an actor?
Well, I think in particular with most of the best Orson Welles performances I can think of, I think his lane is specifically that he's so great at playing is handsome, devil-may-care attitude that is secretly actually the walls are closing in on and that he's going to be found out, and that a lot of his confidence is going to be blown up in his face. If you think about, obviously, Charles Foster Kane and Citizen Kane. You think of him in
The Third Man, of course.
The Third Man, which he didn't direct, but it's very Wellesian in general and kind of inspired by Wells. Hardly handsome, but you think of him in Touch of Evil, his grotesque version of who he is in that. That again, I think a lot of his best performances were like this man who seems so wise and ahead of everybody else, but actually the walls are closing in on him. And I think that in his own way, that the ability for him to kind of self-deprecate himself on screen, I think is one of his most interesting qualities in terms of as an actor, and in particular as an actor in the movies that he directed.
Yeah.
And again, I think he's terrific in this as a guy who's trying to play it cool and trying to act like he's, there's nothing to hide, but actually the whole time there's always somebody right around the corner, whether it be Robinson, whether it be his wife, whatever it is. I just think he's terrific at that in this. What do you think of him as an actor?
Yeah, I mean, because that's honestly what he should be, I think, more remembered as anyway, is an actor, because it's so much. I mean, other than Charlie Chaplin or like Eric Van Sloan, what's his name? He made Greed.
Eric von Stroheim.
Eric von Stroheim.
Yeah.
And there were others of this also, but just actor-directors was not as common, obviously, at the time. Méliès did a little bit of that, but that's even way more complicated than just saying that. But I guess that was a lot more common with comedy directors like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, or even Fatty Arbuckle.
Yeah.
Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. But to see an actor become a director in his own way was big back then. I think that's another thing why a lot of people in the industry were so hostile to Welles at the time. Also, more than likely, was that he wanted to be an actor and director and writer, and that was seen as so arrogant by the studios in general.
Yeah.
Thankfully, all of it worked out for him, but I feel like there could have been, and I think everybody says this, but there could have been so much more from Welles in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it's just really a shame that there wasn't. Not to say that he couldn't have been a little less arrogant.
Yeah.
Either. He's clearly a very arrogant man.
Mm-hmm.
But also, obviously, a total genius. So, in that way, it pains me that there isn't more of a focus on his acting. I feel like, because that's what he started out as in the theater anyway. And
on the radio.
And on radio. Because he's just got that voice of a generation, But I think in this, I will say, just to criticize the movie slightly, I feel like there are some versions of that here that I find out, and maybe it's just because he's got this American accent, it's hard for me to believe, he's a Nazi war criminal throughout.
Yeah.
Because there's not as much expostulation on that, I suppose.
Yeah.
It feels like everybody else is putting accusations towards him or just speaking facts towards him that he then has to react to and kind of hide himself from. I don't feel like that's always the best performance in that way. So in that way, I don't think he gives the performance of a lifetime here. I think in general he's really great. I mean, obviously him as Charles Foster Kane is great. Him in even Othello is great. I feel like he always, when he acted in other people's movies, he was always great too. Obviously with The Third Man or even oh god, it just escaped me. There was another one I was... Well, I mean, he was in movies like A Safe Place or whatever later, which I haven't seen all that, or which at that point it became, Orson Welles is in my movie kind of thing. But obviously there were versions of that where he worked with other people and was great also. But I
think he's great in Chimes at Midnight, which
or in Touch of Evil we mentioned already. But but
by that point, even in both of those movies, he's a little more to the side. He's not necessarily the lead as much anymore.
Yes.
But
so anyway, that's all to say that because then you have Charlton Heston playing a Mexican, which is hilarious.
Yeah,
everybody talks about that, but yeah, that's all just say he's normally a great actor. I'm not saying he's bad here. I think he's even better here than he is in Lady from Shanghai.
Yeah.
That's almost like a kabuki sideshow performance anyway, in my own opinion. That's just sometimes I think he's working on the other. I think he really worked well on those other performances that he's asking of Loretta Young and Edward G. Robinson than himself.
Yeah.
Particularly Loretta Young. But yeah, I guess we'll speak about Robinson briefly because he basically just plays Edward G. Robinson here, which is fine because Edward G. Robinson's great. But what do you think about him in this as a... For him, what was at this time, and I mean, he had done versions of this before now, and would go back to it literally with Key Largo the next few years, about 2 years later. But as a villain... obviously, was what he was always seen more as.
Yeah, he'll always be, Little Caesar.
Right.
Him and that. And that was that along with Cagney and the Public Enemy were just such huge defining gangster, that early gangster movie genre that for many people he was seen as this, the villain of a generation, and he was in a lot of movies from the 30s. But as the 30s turned into the 40s, he was more a hero in things. Edward G. Robinson as an actor in general has grown on me over the years.
What was that movie? It was The Whole Town's Talking, that John Ford movie he was in. He was kind of... Well, he played a hero and a villain in that.
Yeah, it was like a guy that was basically a doppelganger for a bad gangster guy, and he'd been mistaken.
But he was much more the...
That's kind of a comedic thing. But
also, his main performance in that also was the good guy.
Yeah,
that.
Right. But I think he is perfect for this role at this time as this kind of world-weary detective who the whole time he has literally and figuratively the images of the Holocaust in his back pocket, and he's not showing that to anybody, and he kind of withholds that until he shows Wells' wife in the movie those images. And so he has this really great, I don't really want to be here, I'd rather kind of be out of this whole life, especially out of what he's seen from the war and from the aftermath with the Holocaust. And so he is really perfect as this detective who is ingratiating himself in this town to try to track down and figure out where this Nazi is.
Right.
And so much of the perversity of the movie is this idea that Wells's Nazi is like, again, immersed himself in this quaint little New England town, that he's marrying the daughter of a Supreme Court justice, which still puts him in the proximity of power. And so I think Robinson almost represents literally and figuratively the ugly truth in terms of obviously is the hero, but I'm gonna bring the ugly truth down in this town about just who's marrying into this family, and that I'm going to kind of rip apart this myth, but it's for the better of everybody that the myth be ripped apart. So I think he just represents a really great character in that regard.
Right.
And again, a character that you don't get a lot of You don't get a lot of insight outside of him as an investigator, but I think that's fine because with the cachet of who he is, especially this era of Hollywood, he brings with him the cachet of whoever G. Robinson is into that. And so I think in that way he's brilliant to cast in that role at this time.
Yeah, I'll co-sign all that. Loretta Young is Mary Longstreet Rankin. She's the daughter of Philip Merivale, who's the Supreme Court Justice Adam Longstreet. She calls him by his first name all the time, by the way, which is so strange to me. But what do you think about Loretta Young in this? Because I feel like she wins the movie.
Yeah, she's really good because she represents almost the audience that no, her husband or Orson Welles, he can't be a Nazi. He's too nice and he's too handsome and he's too smart and he's too all the good stuff. And I think again, so much of the we know early on as the audience that he's not who he says he is.
Right.
But so much of the tragedy and heartbreak of the movie, to the extent that it exists, rests on her realization, but then also kind of complicity in making sure that he remains unscathed and he remains hidden.
Right.
What about her works for you in this?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of said this in my review of the movie that I wrote for Letterboxd, that to me she kind of represents the I think it's a natural progression for her in the movie, let me say that. The allowance of fascism, or the way that fascism survives, is by others not wanting to admit these things to themselves, or that these things are wrong, or this kind of silent acceptance of
that kind of double-sided complicity that she has with it.
And so obviously that's a way more complicated version of it here than it was in, I think, real life. I think that most people in Germany were obviously totally fine with these things happening, or were fine enough with it to just keep their mouths shut.
But she does kind of represent the conscience of, that can't happen here though.
Right.
And the grim statement that Wells is making as a director in the movie is, yes, it can, and yes, it can, and we need to be vigilant against that type of subversion.
As we have discussed on air, off air, everywhere, is that we were so worried about communism in the late 40s that we let fascism take root in America, and it's never really left in a lot of ways. And I would not go so far as to call this a fascist nation. I don't, for all its problems, I don't believe this country is like utterly fascist. But there are.
The Second Red Scare did represent a fascist, a second wave of sorts of the hostility to communism.
Yes, and in general, a lot of the. But
hostility to the left in general,
and more what I mean is those have gotten into such an implicit nature that they don't come out so much in America. They do every so often, in like protests. When there's protests in America, there's always that police presence, and not that there shouldn't be a police presence, but it always leads to looking like Nazism. I mean, that's what it always looks like. All this, everybody wearing black and with all these, bulletproof vests and guardrails and all that. I mean, that's just inherently fascist imagery. That's what it is. And so that rears its ugly head in America, especially the last, say, about 10 years. That's been a particular problem. But I don't, like I said, I don't want people to walk away from this podcast thinking that this is, I think, a fascist nation. I feel like there's a lot of fascism in America. But that the issue is that was always this focus we had on, we need to deal with communism, because that's what we were always more worried about anyway. And so a kind of a self-fulfilling failure anyway of communism. And that something that Norman Mailer has said often, that I've heard him say and read in print, is that fascism, I think, is a natural state for humanity that will consistently survive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
some of the basest,
right?
Basis
because that's the easiest.
humanity.
It's because that's the easiest way to control governments, is to just tell people this is the way it's going to be, and if you don't like it, we'll deal with you with violence.
Yeah.
And so that it's a lot more difficult to actually give people democracy. And so, as much as we try, that's going to remain. But I think what Wells is saying is that, he didn't even realize at the time, is that, hey, we need to be remembering this thing is still out there, and And he even said about him, and it's interesting because he even says this through the character of that he's playing, of that the only way to deal with the German is annihilation. Like, you're literally not going to get rid of that ideology. And
one of the dead giveaway moments, and I remember when I put this scene in last time's episode in preview for this, is that dinner table scene where he's kind of saying that, well, the natural order of things is annihilation, and we're all going towards annihilation. And somebody pointed out like an alternative opinion to like the fascist undercurrents that represented the end of, by the end of World War II, what we defeated. The whole idea, well, Marx presented an alternative opinion, and he said Marxist wasn't a German, he was a Jew, and that's ultimately what sticks in Robinson's head as this idea that, wait a minute, so
he was a German, but
so you're saying that the German identity has to be totally separate from the Jewish identity, and that in of itself is of course a prejudiced ethnocentric idea.
So many Jews that were in Germany were seen as literally not German because they were Jewish, and so that idea of, okay, well, they literally are German, they were born in Germany, so you find that anywhere, that nativist attitude you find in America, very much still alive in America today. I deal with that constantly every day. Is that when and sometimes it's not even they're not even meaning it the way it sounds, but it's something that I always make into a learning experience for them. When people say, oh, well, when they'll speak about mostly Hispanic students, they'll say, oh, well, where are they from? Or, and they joke, and they'll say, oh, did you cross the border and need a green card? Which always makes me, rightfully angry. But I'll be like, no, they're an American citizen. They were born in America. They are an American. Yeah. And then they're like, well, what, if you're born in America, you just become a citizen? And I kind of look at them like, well, what are you then? Yeah. Well, you're an American citizen. Where were you born at?
Well,
America.
What you're trying to make them think about is that they're defining Americanness or American citizenship by whiteness, or ethnocentrism.
Right. And I think they think about that genuinely once I talk to them about it.
Because probably that's the first time they've been even challenged on that idea before. So,
that's something that always, it's the same thing. It's like, oh, they're not Americans. Like, well, they were born here, so they are actually, by the way. I
think one thing about this movie that really sticks out is there's a lot of, during the mid to late 40s through the 50s, there's a lot of movies and books and art in general and the culture that was like all about finding the secret communist, and there's communists everywhere and the secret communist. And one of the reasons this movie sticks out in a good way, like a sore thumb, is that it's about the secret fascist, and that immediately feels apart from so much of the Cold War narrative, both at the time and later, is that the idea that fascism actually are a far greater threat than communism still survived and is literally within America itself and is burrowed within America.
Well, and I've had, not to go too far into this, but I've had disagreements with people I won't name about, they probably would never even listen to this podcast anyway, but about what was more of a threat, fascism or communism, and this person, of course, said communism because they're more right-wing anyway. Because, all the wars that happen and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay. So, even though that even could possibly be true of, like, the Vietnam War or the Korean War, which, by the way, the United States and Western, what would be more right-wing countries instigated far more by being there. By saying that also is like, well, also negates the fact that, okay, so fascism was so reviled and so dangerous that in a certain sense people are like, okay, let's put that over here to the side, not really actually deal with it because it implies too much about ourselves.
Yeah.
That has lived on and survived, that it's still, but then it's like almost going back to saying, okay, well, what about all these like prototypical or versions of fascist nations that then fought these communist nations that caused a lot of that violence in themselves, or it was a mutual causation? Either way, I don't want to act like it's totally communism is a great thing, because it's not either. But there is this lack of equating that I find very frightening, and an acceptance of, fascism isn't dangerous. Like, no, inherently, even by the base of, and you can talk about what communism becomes or what communism ultimately is, but even at its base level of what fascism is as an ideology is far more dangerous than what communism is, because even communism at its base says what is a positive message. Now you can say whatever it becomes is whatever it becomes.
Yeah.
But
at least
right.
aspires for equality.
Fascism never desires to be that ever. So anyway, that's all just to say that I've gotten into conversations with people about that I didn't even defend myself like I did here, because I'm like, they're just not even gonna listen anyway. Because also they're an older person, so anytime a younger person speaks, they're just going to ignore whatever it is.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So, well, they were also from past eras that were ripe with that propaganda anyways.
Yeah, right, so it's whatever. Yeah. But anyway, that's all to say that, to get back to Loretta Young, what is so great about her performance is that this almost like hyperventilating defense of a man that she barely even really knows anyway.
Yeah, right.
Which I find interesting. I don't see that so much as a negative in the movie as it is just the reality of like these ideas of matrimony, what that meant in the 1940s, and I must defend this person and do this, and you know, an interesting line that kind of is a throwaway is that moment when Edward G. Robinson's like, oh, well, since he actually was here under false pretenses, you won't be legally bound to defend him in court. Like, that's even a genuine concern for anyone involved of like, oh, well, you don't have to defend him. It's okay. Like, but it's like, why would you anyway? I'd break that bond like that, but that, you know, that just says something about that anyway. But, but yeah, she's really great, like you said, because
she represents the moral complexity of the movie as a character in a roundabout way. What do we think, too, about the movie's use of Holocaust footage in this? That had to be incredibly shocking, obviously, back in the 40s to see, and it's kind of shot from afar, but you still do get the glimpses of almost a mountain of corpses.
Right. And it's different, of course, from Night and Fog, which came about in the next decade.
Yeah.
I feel like, though, ultimately, obviously, the way that Europe dealt with and European art cinema dealt with the Holocaust was far quicker, far more expedient, and far more in your face about it. Confrontational. Because they had to, because it was all right there.
Yeah.
It was all left behind. It wasn't like America where it was far away from it, and it kind of got beamed to us by way of what would become television.
Yeah.
And that's a different. So this is different, but still, for people to even see that, and even be within a year of VE Day, you know, or a little bit over a year of VE Day, and really in those few months in the summer of 45, ultimately, where they were actually really finding all that stuff and filming it and actually starting to have to deal with it and piece it together from both American and British and French perspectives.
Yeah.
That is still very shocking to see. Of course, not, like I said, not as much as Night and Fog, for example, or other movies that would come or even like implications of things in like another Alain Resnais film, Hiroshima Mon Amour.
Yeah.
But that well,
I love too in that scene that some of the footage is like just literally shot over Edward G. Robinson's face, like it's being projected on his face, and again that represents like that world wariness that he's been carrying with him the whole time about what this is all really about, and we can try to make it about this or that, but ultimately I'm going to confront your knowledge of this with this, you know, this.
And obviously he was such a part of American cinema, but it's important to note, of course, that he was from Romania and was Jewish, Romanian Jewish. And that being just kind of implicit part of his persona of saying like, oh, well, that Romanian Jew would be leading is the agent in charge here to deal with this problem is kind of an implicitness I find that's important to this movie too. I mean, he has a very American name, Wilson, like, you know, but that's a whole part of this point too, I think.
Why do you think this movie is not as well remembered as I think a lot of it, as far as within Welles' filmography? I think a lot of it has to do with, you just think about his 40s, how they went. Like Citizen Kane, of course, was such a huge movie when it came out. But it was more of this like debatable talking point back and forth. I think, you know, later on, it rightfully so got its place
About
as
the
one of the
50s,
great
yeah.
movies of all time and continues to be. The Magnificent Ambersons is primarily defined by that the version that exists is not as quote as good or as profound as initial early versions of that. Some said it was even greater than Citizen Kane. Then even what we're going to get into later with Lady from Shanghai is so gonzo and so memorable in its own way that Stranger kind of appears in the middle of all these. And I think due to partly its political context, but also just it's a little bit more of a sober movie stylistically, and so it doesn't have as many of the hallmarks that are
it
remembered
feels
as
like
some
you
of his
could
earlier
turn a
movies
quarter.
or
It feels
later
like you
movies.
could turn a corner somewhere and you would be in It's a Wonderful Life. Like it looks like that same kind of America. So it's very much like
but
that.
But why do you think this just isn't? I mean, it's generally well liked, but it's not as fondly remembered to some extent as some of these other movies.
I think it's the sobriety of the movie. Yeah. I think it's just so dark and serious about what it's saying about America and even the implication of the time by saying, oh, well, okay, well, he just happened to come here. And it's like, well, really, it's about how easy fascism is to take root anywhere. And that America was a version of that in the first place, and that really only by association that we went with Britain into the war in France, rather than genuine attitudes that were very clearly and concisely expressed by American citizens in the late 30s. And, so that I think that's all too complex for people to care about. But I think it's just a movie that kind of slipped under the radar for all that. And to speak, this is kind of off topic, but speak briefly back about Magnificent Ambersons, I wonder how great that version actually was compared to, as we said, the way people viewed Citizen Kane at the time and saying, oh, this is even better than Citizen Kane. It's like, but was it actually, or was it that you felt that then? I wonder about that sometimes.
I think that's true.
About what is
just
the
the
real
legend
rap
and the
on
myth
that.
of that has grown over the years, but I think that context is important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you watch the movie and it's clear it's like a bigger, like a generational story, and it's very like very Tom Wolfe like, or Thomas Wolfe rather. Sorry. It always gets confusing.
You're the second person this week I've talked to about Tom Wolfe who made that understandable.
Yes. Sorry. Well, I know who both of them are, but that Thomas, a very Thomas Wolfian like. Early 20th century American family story of highs and lows and that sort of thing, and so a lot of people are more interested in that, I think, inherently than what Citizen Kane is. But
Citizen Kane also represented it's not a noir exactly, but it has a lot of noirish elements and was a huge influence on noir. And then obviously Magnificent Ambersons is something a little different. And then this represents really his first true foray into noir, as it was developing during this time period. And certainly Lady from Shanghai is an even later version of that. What for you, though, is kind of the legacy or biggest takeaway you can categorize The Stranger with in terms of what it represents for noir, but also this period of classic Hollywood, and even maybe for Welles' career as well?
Well, it's one of the few movies. I mean, I still feel stupid. I haven't seen The Best Years of Our Lives in total yet, but those it's just crazy to me how movies were made so quickly back then, and the thought process and the of politics and movies and all that was just so expedient and so quick, and that because we had and I mean that's the difference between now and then, is that studios, and people talk as bad as they want about studios back then, but studios actually had faith in genuine producers, writers, and directors to make things that were art. That was something they were concerned with. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the major difference, because it's like, well, what changed about people? Are people not smarter now than they were then? Well, ultimately not, I don't think. But also, but there's enough smart people out there making movies. So it's like, well, what's the difference? And the difference is that the studios are not allowing those people to take full control like they used to. Because we talk about the 50s or the 60s and 70s as the New Hollywood as the auteur era, but I think that sometimes is to negate the fact that they really did let writers, especially, and actors and filmmakers, to say, "I want you, you do this thing."
Well, so they made so much. They made so many movies that I think the risk per movie was less than it is
so they're
now.
like, do whatever you want to do, or they they'd bring on whoever to write a couple lines of this, and then and move on, and and we saw that go into the.
But I mean, some of the best
70s
periods
also,
of this, the late '40s, were from those directors who came back. Whether it be Frank Capra finally coming back to America and doing "It's a Wonderful Life." He actually mostly spent most of his time in D.C. in the war, but made those Why We Fight movies.
George Stevens,
but also even John Huston comes back and does Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I mean, William Wyler doing Best Years of Our Lives. So they all came back with these different perspectives. And I think, and I say this as a massive fan of It's a Wonderful Life. It's actually grown on me more and more. That is among the more glass half full versions of post-war America, because a lot of these movies are pretty dark in terms of their...
you saw that with Samuel Fuller also, some of his early movies, and going into the 50s as far as movies he would make. And he was a little more independent than those, but he still made movies for big studios. But yeah.
But so I think The Stranger represents a joyful... joyful is a weird way to describe it, but like a pleasant square peg in a round hole in terms of it just represents, by this point, among the most political films that Welles had made. And also definitely just that it's a noir that is not afraid to tell some very harsh truths about America in terms of the complicity with Nazism and the complicity of fascism, and also again of Welles willing to portray himself as the very problem in terms of the character that he represents. So I think this movie has a decent shot at being one of the most underrated movies of the 40s, which is saying a lot because there's tons of great movies in the 40s, but I think, as a noir, it's kind of slept on, and certainly as a 40s Orson Welles movie, it's not as immediately big or iconic as some of the other ones. Of course, Citizen Kane is truly his greatest film, I think, in a lot of ways, and one of the greatest films of all time, but this represents a little something different, and it's weirdly not as ambitious, but in terms of, stylistically speaking, but in terms of the harsh truths, it's very ambitious. It's, communicating.
Yeah, and I guess to leave it, we've talked a lot about the scene that you used last week, but I keep thinking about that scene of it's like an Andy Hardy movie gets dead effing serious. It's like very like, this idea of, they've got everybody's sitting at the dinner table, and then it's like, what do you think about this whole Germany thing? And then it's like literally one of the masterminds of the Holocaust sitting right there with you, and like saying what you kind of saying both what you want to hear, but also telling you what the German really thinks about this that you're sitting and eating and talking about, and how what a sham he thinks all of America really is, and I find that to be just very disturbing, and kind of just the contrast of the dinner table of just the people at the dinner table, and that conversation I think is what the movie's really all about.
Earlier, it was before or after the paper chase was going on too. A classic 1940s
so it's
game.
Like that, and that's funny how that becomes a plot point of hiding a murder. It's like the paper chase that was going on. But anyway.
So that does it for The Stranger. But up next, here's the trailer of The Lady from Shanghai.
Your husband can take care of himself.
Nice night for it, ain't it, Mr. O'Hara? You didn't answer me, Mr. O'Hara. You ought to speak when you're spoken to. I'd hate to have to report you to the lady's husband. I said it's a nice night for it.
Hey, Mike, if you'll pardon me this intrusion, there's a couple of police officers out here.
Cops.
I don't speak their language, see? And they wants me to identify this guy. What's the Spanish for drunken bum?
Mrs. Bannister,
Can you think of any reason why your husband would want to hire a divorce detective other than to watch you?
I object!
As a matter of fact, you and Michael O'Hara have kissed each other, haven't you? To name one occasion, you were seen in the aquarium of this city kissing each other. Do you deny that?
No. No further questions.
So they're that lady from Shanghai, you know. One of the most evocative titles, I think, for a noir immediately goes, wait, what?
I mean,
the lady?
this
Why
very
is
much
she from Shanghai?
is a poster child for noir, I think, in a lot of ways, and the title really goes along with that. But
the Wikipedia page is not giving me the best description ever for it, so let me just really quick.
Because they're like, oh, we don't know.
Something happens.
Some people were there one time.
So this movie came out in...
Did you know about that?
1947, I think partially in France, and 1948. It's kind of funny that this is the description for the movie on Letterboxd. A romantic drifter gets caught between a corrupt tycoon and his voluptuous wife. So this movie, again, is wackadoodle, is crazy. I think literally if you had to like pick 5 prototypical noirs and movies that represent types of noirs, I think this would actually be one of the 5 I pick in terms of just stylistically how gonzo it is, and also how it fits into a lot of larger genre tropes and aspects.
And how about that, lava? Yeah.
And again, this movie was not really all that liked when it came out, but over the years, cinephiles have kind of flocked to it as a prominent, underrated Welles entry in his filmography. The movie's actually even uncredited, technically, is directed by Welles, but if you notice at the beginning it said produced and written by Orson Welles right before the movie starts, so it doesn't even say directed by.
Wow.
So I think he had some problems over the course of the production with the studio, which was Columbia. And another thing is, too, I'll say, I think RKO technically made The Stranger, I believe.
Yeah.
This was made by Columbia. You can tell it has a little bit more of a budget behind it in terms of visually how it looks.
Well, also, it's important to note that as great as The Stranger is and as great as the Blu-ray that was made for it is, it being a public domain movie, the prints of it are not as good looking as this is, because this has been restored a lot over the years, and that hasn't. So, yeah.
So, we'll go through the cast fairly quickly here. Rita Hayworth as Elsa, or Rosalie Bannister. Singing voice was dubbed by Anita Kurt Ellis, though. So, when I think of Rita Hayworth and when I think of noir, I think first and foremost of Gilda, which is a movie in and of itself that has its own flaws, but is very memorable in terms of as a noir centerpiece. She represents in this the femme fatale, the guy.
Femme fatale.
She's married to Everett Sloane as Arthur Bannister, who's of course been in other Welles things.
There's not one day I don't think about that girl, as he said in Citizen Kane.
Most memorably in Citizen Kane.
Mr. Kane was very... Yeah, you know how he talks. Right?
But I think Rita Hayworth, in terms of the femme fatale, blonde bombshell archetype in noir, is, again, one of the reasons she's most remembered is how memorable she is in this. I think she's terrific in terms of this morally ambiguous character.
Yeah, I mean, she's not really asked to perform much, because that's kind of how all these femme fatales really are, is because it's just all they just have to be there and kind of look dangerous, and that's, you know, about all they have to do. But yeah, I mean, I think she's effective. So
Welles plays Michael O'Hara, and his Irish accent very, very strong in
his
this.
Irish brogue, But
what do you think of him in this?
So weird. I mean, because normally you think of him in just his regular voice, you know, and but I'm not sure of what is his from what stock does he originate? Are you sure?
It says Irish sailor.
No, I'm talking about him. Actual
Welles?
Orson Welles himself. Yeah.
Let's see.
He probably is like Irish or something. Wisconsin's where he's from, I think. But
on his Wikipedia page, I don't think it's really saying. immediately what his ethnicity is or whatnot.
Yeah.
So I'm not
anyway,
sure.
I would assume he's probably
from the Isles somewhere
there.
Yeah.
The British of some sort. It's
funny. He probably delighted.
Like Ireland, Britain, whatever. And it's like, did you know they're not very happy with each other most days?
But I mean, he probably reveled in doing the accent in this because he's obviously of a theatrical background, so he probably loved.
But I mean, I kind of love it, but I don't know if it's always good. You know, but I mean, it's...
But he plays the, classic, I'm just a drifter, and I have this shadowy past, and I'm from Ireland, but I was also involved in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republic.
You ran guns to Ethiopia. Yeah, I mean...
So he just represents, he's a stand-in for a guy that could have been involved in many conflicts. He's like a more loser version of Rick from Casablanca in terms of being a drifter, but not really being successful in any meaningful way.
But that's the funny thing about his whole character is he puts on like that. I mean, because there's points in the movie where he's just straight up fighting people, getting in fist fights and stuff. But other than that, he's an incredibly unsuccessful human being in every respect. I mean, and I feel like there have been versions of that before this in noir. I mean, Detour, literally a few years before, was a big version of that. But I feel like this was the first major version of it I can think of just a total failure of a noir lead. And that always being implied most of the time.
And we know that his own decisions are going to lead to his own self-destruction.
Right, because normally before that, you had seen all these detective movies where it's even if they're morally ambiguous, they usually have to be successful because they're the law. And so there's some...
adjacent to the law.
Right, there's some form of justice that has to be served.
Yeah.
That normally, I said, in this is not a priority whatsoever because he's not even actually a detective or anybody. Same thing with the guy in Detour. And so it's easier to do that. I feel like eventually though they did that with private eyes and detectives and police. But I feel like a good version of that's Glenn Ford in The Big Heat too. Who's this very just volatile individual in a lot of ways. That in this also, I mean, I think he really works as what he is, but it's I say it's just a very different kind of character for this time. Don't you think, as we're getting into Everett Sloane here and kind of talking about
real quick,
this, go ahead.
Wells and Rita Hayworth were famously married throughout most of the 40s. This was in the midst of the dissolution of their marriage and when they were basically about to get divorced. And so there is a tragic element to that plays out on screen in terms of these doomed lovers.
A tragic comedy element, wouldn't you say? Yeah. But
again, these
what
doomed
about
lovers.
that doom lover? Don't you think, by the way, right before we get to Everett Sloane, I never thought about this until watching it this time because I'd seen this movie in college just the once and then saw it again now. Don't you think there's some version of The Master that was inspired by this because it's very much like getting on a boat to go to where and that it was you went to San Francisco and went to New York. Instead it's the opposite trip here. But this idea of on this boat with this guy that you don't really know and then his wife's there and is the wife really running things. It's I know that's about different things and about totally different relationships. But I feel like there's some seed there.
I was thinking about that a little bit. Taking a slow boat to China in a roundabout way too. I think there's definitely
all to myself alone.
And I know I don't remember specifically the influences he named when doing The Master. I remember one of them was that documentary John Huston did.
Let There Be Light.
Let There Be Light was one. And I know that I think he said multiple times that his favorite movie ever, well, years ago he said it was Network, but PTA said was
Treasure
of the Sierra Madre. And there's some elements of that in The Master too. So I definitely think there's a lot of these movies from the 40s that were probably on his mind when he was writing and constructing that.
Yeah.
And I think this probably was definitely one of them anyways. But so I think that's true.
Yeah. But
Everett Sloane as Arthur Bannister, total... I think we're all just she's married to him. He's just such a pipsqueak.
He's this lawyer. He's basically this criminal lawyer who also is disabled. He's got canes that he walks around with all the time.
Yeah.
And so in that way, I feel like that's almost just for the ending of the movie, just to have that look of that. It's so weird. But
but I think it's like implicitly, it's like he's not even a full man,
right?
And Orson Welles' character represents
Orson Welles is a brogue.
Michael O'Hara represents
the brogue.
And then just to go through some of these other people real quick, Glenn Anders is George Grisby.
I want to talk about him for a while.
Ted DeCorsia as Sidney Broom, Erskine Sanford as the judge, Gus Schilling as Goldie Goldfish, Carl Franklin, one of the great names, as District Attorney Galloway. It says that Errol Flynn is uncredited as man in background outside of Cantina.
What?
Also,
I've been right.
Give us your Glenn Anders take, though.
Wait a minute. Who did you say it was?
Errol Flynn.
Errol Flynn
is man in background outside of Cantina.
He was like dead.
No, he lived until 59.
Oh, he lived that old. Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought he died.
He
okay.
Lived, until 1959.
Oh, all right.
He probably literally was hanging out on set and was like barely in a shot or something. Yeah. But
what was your question? I'm sorry.
Give us your take on Glenn Anders as George Grisby.
Oh my God!
It's the heart of the kind of conspiracy.
So to speak a little, because we haven't even really talked about what the plot of this movie is like so insane. So like basically, from what I remember, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it's literally that he's like wants to fake his own death.
Grisby.
Yeah.
So
that then he can put it all on Everett Van Sloan,
Everett Bannister,
character, Arthur Bannister, for whatever reason. I think it was. Well, that's what he's. He
works under him now, right?
Well, they're like partners or something.
Yeah.
And but then it turns out he was actually doing that so that then he could have somebody else be killed or something, and then I don't remember, but basically it ends up where he gets killed actually, and but he was wanting to get Michael O'Hara to help him with that, and then basically I think he was going to set him up basically, and there's somehow money was involved in all this. I don't remember what it was, but then eventually he actually gets killed instead, and then there's a whole trial against him about that.
He's just such a weird
but this Grimsby guy, literally, like, everything he does is the weirdest thing ever. Like, there's that scene that I think you used last week where he's like, "That's good too, Arthur," and like, literally the way he talks, and he's like, one of the weirdest moments in the movie is so Wellesian, like, where she's like, "Can you light my cigarette?" It's like him, like Everett Van Sloan's talking, and then it cuts away, and it's like he's still talking during this. It's like a first version of overlapping dialogue. And she's like, "Can you light my cigarette?" To him, he's like, "I haven't got a match." Like, and just everything he does is so weird. And then something that we've just been obsessed with, the first thing we'll talk about, and then the major one we'll get to next.
I was just looking. Well, go ahead.
No, you go ahead and say what.
I'm just looking at some other things he's in. One of my already favorite titles ever, Nancy Goes to Rio.
Oh,
was a movie he was in 1950. Need to see that. Tarzan's Peril. The 1951 version of M, which was directed by Joseph Losey. I think that's how you say his name. Of course, a remake of the Fritz Lang movie. And in 1951, he was in a movie called Behave Yourself, also. Mostly comedies, it looks like, but yet he's in this, and he definitely brings a comedic element, as you were saying.
Yeah, because, like... Yeah, it's just so strange.
And also, I think just the fact that there's any kind of conspiracy coming from this guy shows you it's doomed to fail instantly. And that there's,
But, because there's the moment that we've been obsessed with, we'll go ahead and put the video in here, but he's like, well, we'll let it play for a second.
Here's to crime.
Where literally, he's like, "Here's to crime," and then drinks this beer, and the music's playing. He's like, and then it just cuts back to Orson Welles, and he's just like looking at him like he wants to laugh, kind of, and it's like, and that's what's so strange about the whole movie is like the Orson Welles character acts the whole time like he can't escape from this situation.
Yeah,
it's like, well, you can get off on any port you want to.
Yeah, that's the beauty of being a drifter is you can immediately walk away, but he's so in love with Rita Hayworth's character that he just can't do it.
It's just hilarious to me. He just won't give it up. And then the piece de resistance of this character, though, is him telling him, "I'm going to pay you $5,000 to do this thing." And he's like, "What?" And this is what happens.
So long, fella.
kill me. So long, fella. Like,
and it's treated as this moment like he's
Yeah.
gonna die or something's
Right.
happening, but
Yeah.
he's really just walking away. It's just like,
well, it's weird because he's like walking out of the frame, but then the music goes crazy, and it's
Yeah.
like the shot's already weird because you couldn't see it, obviously, but where his like it's kind of above him, and he's like got his face angled up, and his
Yeah.
hair's all messed up, and it's just such a weird
Yeah.
moment in general. But like you said, any movie that bets the farm on this guy to be the mastermind,
you know,
like,
it's gonna fail miserably. Yeah. But I think that's part of the central joke of the movie, and and that's the extent to which I want to get into the style of this movie, because it's got some of the most memorable stylistic moments in noir, whether it be, of course, the Hall of Mirrors scene at the end, which actually just this last week was referenced a lot on film Twitter, due to some shot that was in a recent movie or TV show that involved mirrors. I can't even remember what it was.
There's Moon Knight. Yeah.
Right. That, in reference to that, and then, but also the aquarium scene, which I'd kind of forgotten about, but is often talked about, of this very strange meeting between Wells and Hayworth in an aquarium, and these like octopuses and their big shadows casting, and it's one of the weirdest kind of settings in a noir movie, but I think it almost feels like something ripped out of a Batman the Animated Series episode. Obviously Batman the Animated Series would be more inspired by this than the opposite, obviously. But again, it just has such a weird gonzo style, especially in comparison to The Stranger. What do you take away from kind of the style of this movie, and then also how seriously we're expected to take the narrative itself?
Well, and that is, I think, what makes the movie work, is that thankfully the narrative isn't too complicated. I mean, it's crazy and it's weird.
Yeah.
I'm just not remembering all the details right now in my head, but I don't feel like
it's definitely got a much more involved plot even than The Stranger had.
Right, but as far as compared to something like The Big Sleep, it's at least makes enough sense. It's not like it's incomprehensible.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is all about the style. I mean, it's about the aquarium. It's about the ending of the movie.
Yeah.
It's about, because the ending of the movie is literally, it's like, that's what it's all about.
And it's about that tension of these people shouldn't want each other, but they are attracted, and it's just going to bring about ruin for all of them. That whole mentality.
And so, because like I said, the whole ending is almost to get like 4 or 5 different images on the same screen of Everett Van Sloan. Everett Sloan walking with like crutches in like a hall of mirrors, like and just some of the imagery of that. I mean, like that's like some of the most surreal imagery in any movie up to that point, I think, of other than some, so there's some movies that were made during the silent era. They're like, what is this? But especially in like a Hollywood, pretty mainstream movie, that was big. So things that, like I said, Hitchcock was messing around with, but ultimately would do more, I think, in the into the 50s. Which is interesting because Hitchcock and Welles Welles always had these weird things to say about Hitchcock that was very critical.
Welles had a lot
of
critical things to say about a lot of people, from Ingmar Bergman to Hitchcock to just practically a lot of his own contemporaries. He had some.
Well, I think he also saw Hitchcock as a version of himself, that he was far more successful and
made way more movies,
and a popular version of him that. A lot of people didn't like Hitchcock.
He famously said about Vertigo that it's even worse than Rear Window, which
is true in the inverse. It's even better than Rear Window. Wheel Window with my favorite movie. Tham I Am. I don't know. But so long, fella. But ultimately,
but I think again, I think The Stranger, in comparing these two movies, The Stranger is far more what I like and my jam. But what I do love about The Lady from Shanghai is just how crazy it is, and just how like over the top, and how, in a good way, preposterous it is comparison to this. And again, this is one of those movies. The Lady from Shanghai's kind of general box office failure, and Wells souring with the studio. The beginning of the end of him in Hollywood long term before he went to Europe. Now, he later came back to Hollywood some, but then went back to Europe. So in that way, it's kind of unfortunate, obviously, as you said earlier, that he didn't make more things here in Hollywood, but again, I think The Lady from Shanghai represents him at his most like gonzo noir in terms of just how wild and crazy the movie is. Any other thoughts about Lady from Shanghai?
No, I liked it more this time just because I focused a lot more on just how weird the movie is, and appreciated that more than like all the like plot mechanics and just kind of like what is going on. Like I feel like though seeing this for the first time was very much like a shock to the system, just like and coming off of like admittedly also that was. I don't think I had seen any other Orson Welles movies at that point other than Citizen Kane. And so coming off of that to that, it's kind of just like, I don't know what to do with this. It's like, but now having seen a lot more of his movies since then, it feels easier to place it where it needs to be, I feel like, in his kind of milieu. But, yeah.
So that about does it for this episode of Overlapping Dialogues, One Time Noirvember.
Here's to crime.
But... Jeff Probst, what have we got next week?
Stay tuned for scenes from our next episode.
You know how people die?
Yeah. Why?
And then after they die, they go to heaven?
I guess, if they're good. I mean, why not?
You know how it works in heaven?
Not exactly.
It's probability and outcome.
Probability and outcome?
Probability and outcome.
I never knew that.
Yeah, well... Let's say there's a probability that some guy's gonna die. Well, what happens is an escort from the guy's way station gets a signal, and he goes down, and he has to wait for the outcome. You see? Now, if the guy lives, the escort wasted a trip. But if the guy dies, he picks him up, and he takes him right back up to his way station, and he puts him in line for, you know, his final destination. You follow me?
Yeah. Hey, do you mind if I smoke?
No, go ahead. Now, let's say there's a new escort. See? He's really raw. He gets a signal, he takes off, and he sees a guy say, riding a bicycle into a tunnel. All right, the car's coming the other way, and the escort, he's supposed to wait for the outcome, but this guy's new, and he figures, well, the guy's a goner. He's sure that that's going to happen. So he figures, well, why should I just make him sit there and have the car hit him, you know? Why don't I just take him out of there a few seconds early and take him right back up to his way station?
Listen, I need a match.
That clock over there, that's a lighter. So the thing is, the guy he takes up to the way station, he's not just some ordinary guy. He's an athlete with fantastic reflexes, and it turns out he wouldn't have hit the car at all, you see?
How do you
wind
like
it?
this
Wind
car?
it. Oh. Now, the guy wasn't really dead, you understand? His number wasn't up for years. He would have missed the car.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Hey, look at the time. Is this lighter right?
I don't think so. Max, do you see what I'm saying? They're supposed to put him back in his body, but they can't because he's been cremated. So what they have to do is find another body to put him in.
I'm just a trainer. I mean, what you need is, well, like a really good doctor.
Are you sure he's part of your gene pool, Charlie? Shit.
Alert, everybody. What about the expectations of coaching a team like this in a community like this?
Well, I guess there's always a surprise or two in every community.
Ball. Just concentrate on hanging on the ball. Both hands, okay?
Hey.
Both hands, that's all.
Hey, come here. Come here. What's the problem?
Get off the field, Dad.
Why can't you hold on to the football? It's so goddamn hard about holding on to it.
I'm sorry.
All you got to do is hold on to the goddamn football, and you can't do it. Tell me why you can't do it. Just tell me. That's all I want to know.
I'll try better next time.
Come on. Hey. Don't you walk away from me. Don't you walk away from me when I'm talking to you. You hear me? Tell me why you can't hold on to the ball.
Enough.
Come on.
Mr. Billy,
answer a question. Answer. First day of practice, Mr. Billy. Hold on.
Seriously.
Mr. Billy.
Enough. Charlie. Okay.
Embarrassing me out here.
Okay.
Jesus Christ.
It's all right, John.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. Here we go. That slot right. 38.
Hey, Billy Lee, you ain't got to worry about holding on to the ball, man.
What's that?
Because you ain't going to get the ball. Your job is to be blocking for Booby. I don't care if your daddy is over there crying.
Shut up, do you?
Our team's been playing with each other for a long time, and we got the brotherhood part of it down.
Quite the pairing here.
Are you ready for some football? Here's the football.
Heaven Can Wait from 1978 and Friday Night Lights from 2004. Very different movies. It's
Warren Beatty and Buck Henry and Peter Berg.
Yeah,
you know?
What a trio.
Yeah. One of them wrote The Graduate. The other was Buck Henry. Don't know what that means. That really makes no sense.
So again, these movies are in the height of pigskin season, and when these episodes dropping, it will actually be Black Friday, so right after Thanksgiving. So after you've gone high on the hog, or should I say the turkey, by that point, we thought, we haven't really done any sports movies on here. This would be a good chance to do that. Now, these are very different sports movies, and I would argue Heaven Can Wait's kind of secondarily a sports movie because it's primarily a romantic comedy. We'll start with Heaven Can Wait, of course, from 1978. I think I've said this in the past. We've never done a Warren Beatty movie, I don't think, formally. Warren Beatty's my favorite actor ever. I love him. Even just rewatching the clip, I was so immersed in his performance style, and
Jack Warden too.
And I love Jack Warden too. And Jack Warden is also had a really great role in Shampoo, and even had a small role in Bulworth, and so he's worked with.
I think you need to get a doctor. I don't know.
Beatty multiple times. This movie's about basically a football star or second string football player who was killed.
I was going to say football star is kind of funny.
But actually he wasn't supposed to die until much later in his life, and so it's one of these kind of cosmic supernatural mix-ups, and that was something that was going on in some movies in the 30s and 40s. This movie is in of itself a remake of Here Comes Mr. Jordan, which I've seen. I like fine enough. I don't like nearly as much as this movie, but even something like A Matter of Life and Death, which we're both huge fans of, which kind of involved this supernatural element, and about him kind of swapping bodies with this eccentric millionaire who also, he basically buys the football team, so then he tries to get in shape so he can play on the football team.
And they're all just think he's just this crazy, vain, rich guy, like Warren Beatty.
Yeah.
No.
You're so vain.
He's like, you probably think the song is about you. He's like, it was. What's so funny about that too is then he has all this random baggage that's going on about trying to Charles Grodin and his wife trying to kill him, and all this random stuff going on.
And he's in love with Julie Christie in the movie, and this is the third of 3 movies that Beatty made with Julie Christie.
Yeah.
And they also were this similar to Wells and Rita Hayworth, this romance that lasted for most of the 70s. They made, of course, McCabe, Mrs. Miller, Shampoo, and this. All 3 of those movies are terrific in different ways. But again, I think they are just 2 of the most beautiful people in any era of movies, and so to see them together, it's like this attraction that, of course, bouncing off each other. I love a lot of Warren Beatty movies. Again, he's my favorite actor. This is probably actually my favorite movie from him, ultimately. Weirdly, because it also is not quite as cynical and political, and although I love those movies from him, it's actually among his most heartfelt and straightforward movies. Not only of this era, but throughout his career.
What's great about a movie I don't think Parallax View fits into this because he just acted in that anyway, and that's an Alan J. Pakula movie. So it's taking the politics of that movie and putting that to the side. As far as even a movie like Shampoo, his whole performance and persona elevates the cynicism of that movie to make it, and it is very cynical, and it ends very cynically. But that gives that movie a life, his whole persona that it easily could not have. And so, in this, for example, one of my favorite scenes, another thing I was going to mention, is when he's has to go to the boardroom meetings as the guy. And he's
almost, actually was going to pick this.
And he almost he's like, why don't we just do this? And they're all like,
and then, he also before that he invites the media to come in and listen. They're all wait, why are they in here?
Right.
And then
and he's like, oh no, that's all right, whatever. Yeah. He's like, because that's normal to him as a football player, just have the media there too, I guess. And he's like, oh yeah, just do the best thing for the environment, And they're like, excuse me, and it's that's just one of the funniest things where he's just you can tell he so doesn't care. He just wants to go play football. And he's like, oh, let's get this over with real quick. And picks the best possible scenarios he can do. And just and then another thing too is where he doesn't even care about the affair that Charles Grodin and the guy's wife are having with each other.
Because he don't like her anyway.
Right.
So
and he's just oh yeah, whatever. And they're trying to kill him the whole movie. And he's so oblivious to that, and just oh yeah, whatever, I don't care. And then that makes him want to kill him even more because they're oh, he's up to something. We got to do it. And it just really is a comedy of errors, a very specific kind of movie that I think is the best exemplification of his personality I think this and Bulworth randomly, because that's another movie where he's just like doesn't care.
And again, what I really love about Warren Beatty is that he was as handsome as he was.
Yeah.
Yet almost all of his greatest roles are like screw ups or like tripping over themselves in some way. And again, he's casting himself at the lead of all these movies and is a producer or director, and just his ability to like make fun of himself despite being kind of a vain movie star at the same time is just such a weird contradiction to me.
And a version of that with Reds too, I think, is that's his version of himself, that kind of character of like this hapless idealism and just like, oh yeah, I'll put myself out there in these situations, what John Reed ultimately really was. But also that idea of even that of like the whole randomness of the beginning of that movie is Jack Nicholson as Eugene O'Neill, which I still just think about all the time, is just like, what? And I feel like we need a whole movie of that anyway.
Yeah.
But
he's not in a whole lot of it, but he's terrific in what he's in.
Yeah. And that like even that as a reflection of Beatty's John Reed and his persona in that is he's even being competed with by Eugene O'Neill, played by Jack Nicholson, for this woman, and how he wins out because he's who he is and he's a genius in his own way, and even though he was always gone and always being an activist somewhere, was far more interesting and lovable to her than to Diane Keaton's character than Eugene O'Neill was. But even that is its own. It's not a comedy version of that, but it's like its own version of this desperation and his kind of what's the word? Clueless persona, kind of, of that he always kind of lands on his feet in his way or whatever.
And I feel like I really feel like it's like Cary Grant, if Cary Grant didn't have it together as well, like as far as his persona as an actor. And I feel like we've not really had an actor fill that role before or since, really.
I like your flavor.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like somebody like Steve Martin is like more explicitly a comedic actor, and like a lot of his most famous roles, you think of him in like The Jerk, like, or Man with Two Brains, some of those Carl Reiner movies where he's just a total buffoon and idiot.
Where Merv Griffin is a serial killer.
Forget about that. But I feel like Steve Martin weirdly comes to mind as somebody who's kind of sort of did a version of that, but like, I don't know, just
which of the Pickwick triplets did it, kind of thing.
But again, I just love Beatty so much, and again, I love so many of his movies, and a lot of his movies are among my favorites. But this is probably my all-time favorite. And again, I think it's also just it's got really well-shot sports scenes in it, which of
the L.A. Rams,
the Los Angeles Rams in the late '70s. Friday Night Lights, very different movie stylistically.
Oh yeah, I forgot we had another movie we had to get to.
So Friday Night Lights, that's from 2004. Right. Now you've actually seen the TV show.
Well, good. Some parts of it. I watched quite a bit of the first season, and it was really good. I just didn't ever finish it.
Now that show has become so big that a lot of people even forget that there was a movie made.
Well, there's a book.
Well, the book came first, and then the movie. But the show's legacy is the biggest thing I feel like at this point that's remembered. Now I've not read the book. I knew some people in my life who had and really swear by it and love it. But I think this movie is really good. It's directed by Peter Berg, who has not really made any other movie that I think of as fondly as this. He did direct some of the earliest episodes of The Leftovers, and that does have some of his stylistic tributes.
Yeah, I feel like that whole show is kind of in its own way. They say that about any showrunner at the beginning, or first director kind of determines the look.
Set the standard.
And it is very much a Peter Berg thing.
Friday Night Lights, I think, is one of the best movies about high school football in terms of it is an all-consuming experience. The Persian Panthers, I think that was the name of the team in that, are... Yeah, and somewhere in Texas. Literally, I think they say this like early on. It's like when it's Friday night in the fall in Texas.
Boys of Fall.
Like moment. I mean, this is the preemptive Boys of Fall moment. That it just takes over and is all consuming. And again, I don't think it's quite as strong here in Western North Carolina. However, it is definitely something that dominates and takes over attention. Not to the extent it even is in other parts of the country exactly.
Well, it's a sense of hope. It's weird. It's something that even the NFL doesn't get. It's almost like what they talk about, they call the show in baseball. It's like everybody, it's always the getting to the show, and then after that, it's like it doesn't mean anything anymore almost. But it's this... yeah, and it's not something that I feed off of like other people do, but I see the appeal. I mean, it's really one of the great taglines in anything I've ever seen. This is different because it's college football, but I saw it again today. It was showing college football commercials, and it's called The Greatest Story Ever Played, and it's kind of that idea of like, and you even look at the poster of this movie, and it's like the three guys from behind walking on the field. It looks like this like Greek opera. It's like this like, I'm not even saying that to be like joke. It's like this is life.
Yeah,
it's like, and in that way, it's like this event, this very almost like primal. I feel like Norman Mailer talking about the Rumble in the Jungle now, but like about him talking.
Levi's currently reading the Armies of the Night. So
but where he was talking about the whatever the stadium was that they used was talking about they executed a bunch of like political prisoners, and he's like the blood was under the floor and the warrior's trial and like all this stuff. It's kind of like that, but hopefully they didn't do that in Texas or anywhere. But you know, but yeah, like I feel like that show gets to that, but I would love to see a cinematic version of that. I feel like it would be even more ripe for that idea of what that means.
You know, one of the more memorable for me, Billy Bob Thornton roles. He's the lead as the coach in the movie, and it also has some actors that are bigger now, some not so much in terms of the younger teenagers in the movie. Garrett Hedlund, he's kind of plays one of the kids. Tim McGraw, actually, to me, is one of the most memorable aspects of this movie.
I've never seen what he looked, because you talk about him all the time in this movie. I never seen what he looked like, and then I saw him, and I about want to put my head in my hand, like, oh my God, this guy.
He's basically this abusive dad who used to play football too, and he's always like in his son's face, like, you're not taking it seriously enough. You need to make this your life, and he's just like, lay off or whatever, and again, I know this is based partially on a true story, which was very rich, and obviously the book was made out of it. But again, I think this movie is a really pretty solid representation of high school football and how, for a lot of communities across the United States, it just takes over to the extent to which it's almost just everything else about school, what should be important, it just takes a total backseat.
Well, that's a bit. I mean, that's obviously a really big part of the show, and how that's my favorite scenes is when somebody is giving Kyle Chandler advice, and he's like, and he's like, "I'll kick your ass," basically, like in a version of that. But literally any that, and that's what made that show so intoxicating to me to watch, was him as the coach lead. Is always being like, "You're not going to do this on my team." Like,
so intense,
right? And this whole attitude. And then you go look up. This is really going off topic, but I tried looking up scenes from that show on YouTube, and it was literally like 6 out of like the 12 videos that had to have been that I looked at real quickly were like, he finds this person in bed with this person. It was like a million scenes of that. And it's like, what happens on this show where he's constantly finding kids in bed with other kids? It's like, and now like that's affecting the team or whatever. And like half of the thumbnails of even that were him like looking at him like, you need to understand something, son. Like whole attitude. And I'm just like, I'm so fascinated by that. So I want to get back to watching that show one of these days. But yeah, like I said, I'm really excited to watch this movie because I feel like it'll be a good primer to even get back into that, and also to say, let's make this as cinematic as we can rather than it be just a TV show version of it. Like, let's ramp up the drama of this. Because there were a lot of these types of movies made around this time. Remember, The Titans was a big movie that a lot of people talked about for years. I mean, that was just massive. And then even after this, We Are Marshall around that time. And I've seen that quite a few times.
It's a middle school classic.
I've talked about that movie ad nauseum, I feel like, on here, and about like what is going on with Ian McShane in that movie, like, and David Strathairn also, like, lots of questions. But so yeah, I'm excited to see this one. Also, I think Bill Bob Thornton would make a good coach in this. So we'll see how that goes. Mashed potatoes, no gravy.
So again, by the time you're going to be listening to that episode, it's going to be Thanksgiving already. So,
and we'll have all that
turkey gobbled
It'd be
up.
interesting to think about an L.A. Thanksgiving, because like there's the L.A. Christmas. We've seen that enough in different things, but the L.A. Thanksgiving, we saw that in The Doors. Don't forget. Yeah, hopefully you will have a happy Thanksgiving that does not end in Jim Morrison kicking a turkey around. You know,
or maybe it does if that's what you're into.
Hey, stranger things have happened.
This is Kyle.
This is Levi.
Take care. God bless.
Talking with Orson Welles. I guess I just can't get over that childhood of yours. The little scraps I've read about it, sitting at tables at your age with people who were, well, in other countries for one thing, but sometimes world leaders, I suppose. Or were there any world leaders?
Oh yes, the world leader that really came to nothing, as far as my memory is concerned, was Hitler. I was being escorted. I went twice through the Tyrol and Austrian German hiking country. Once with one teacher and once with another. And one of the two teachers was, it turned out, a sort of a budding Nazi. And there was a big Nazi rally near Innsbruck. In the days when the Nazis were just a very comical kind of minority party of nuts that nobody took seriously at all, except my hiking companion, this gentleman and his knapsack, and he wangled a place at the table with the great men of this tiny little party of cranks. And I remember very well afterwards, Stryker, who was the leader of the big anti-Semitic campaigns, and 2 or 3 other well-known people to this day. The man sitting next to me was Hitler, and he made so little impression on me that I can't remember a second of it.
Gee.
He had no personality whatsoever.
Wonder if
he was invisible.
I wonder if under hypnosis it would come out.
No, I think there was nothing there that anybody'd remember till you had 5,000 people yelling Sieg Heil, Heil Hitler. That's the whole point of the story, that there wasn't anything to remember.
What about those films that were made about him by Leni Riefenstahl?
Pretty good films.
Are they you often hear that
they are awfully well made, yes.
Is she alive?
Yes.
Have you met her?
No, I haven't met her. But she's living, I think, in England or some place like that, and hustling around trying to get, to flog a documentary here and there.
Yeah.
On almost any subject.
Gee, interesting thing.
I never met Stalin. I never met Stalin, but Roosevelt I knew very well, and Churchill, and lots of, during childhood and then youth, of course.
Yeah.
I was very lucky in that respect.
What age were you when you were orphaned?
Well, my mother died when I was 7, and my father died when I was 15, beginning of my 15th birthday. Then I ran away, tried to stay out of school, out of Harvard. I had a scholarship, and desperate not to be educated, I went into the theater. I made it. I wasn't educated.
What if you were now? I mean, what if you wanted to go to school? Do you have any idea what you want to study now?
Gee, that's a good question. Everything, I guess. But if I wanted to study seriously, and get good at a subject, I think it would be anthropology. Don't you think that's a fascinating subject?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I would too. I don't know. Or maybe philosophy. I never thought about it very much.
I'm suspicious of philosophy. I have a real Philistine doubt about its worth, but anthropology seems to me to be just at its beginnings, and philosophy kind of at its end.
Who else stands out from that time in your life? What faces come to mind?
Well, you mean famous ones?
Sure, or infamous.
Yes,
or not famous, or any of that.
Well, we had Schicklgruber, but you know wonderful people that aren't famous. I guess one of the most remarkable people I ever knew was somebody called Cornelia Lunt. And Alfred Lunt used to pretend to be her cousin. They weren't related at all. They loved each other. And she was, when I knew her, in her middle 90s, and had been a hostess of great importance, although very young, in the Civil War in America, and knew intimately all the great names of the Civil War. Could tell you all about what Lincoln said and what my great-grandfather Gideon Wells said, who was Secretary of Navy in the Cabinet. And great kind of raconteur on the Civil War. And then she went over to London where she was at the American Embassy, and where she knew everybody in England. All those fabulous people that seemed to have been dead for 200 years, you know, in the Victorian age. And it was, you could only get her to tell about these things with great difficulty. She didn't go on and on like I do. You had to drag it out of her, and she was delicious. She was an old lady who, when she gave a big party, sat on a little stool, and she gave you a big chair. If you can imagine an old lady like that. She was very beautiful. Must have been not so beautiful when she was young, but one of those people that old age glorifies. And she had a little bell. And when she wanted everybody to be quiet so she could say something, she'd ring her bell. And then we'd all be quiet, and she'd make her little statement, then ring it again, and everybody could talk again. And she's one of the great people I've known, you know, as great, certainly, as Churchill or Roosevelt or George Marshall, and I suppose Marshall is the greatest man I ever met.
Really?
Yes, I would think so.
What would you admire about him above everybody else?
Human being. I think he's the greatest human being who was also a great man, whom I was ever privileged to meet.
Have you known some that were...
Can I tell a little story about him?
Certainly.
We'd been campaigning for Roosevelt, not George Marshall, but some of the rest of us, and one of our rewards when he got in again, one of those many times that he did, was to go to a big party of very big brass and sit on the dais and be treated as though we were part of the high command just for one night. And there were all these tremendous names from the Second World War. 2 or 3 civilians. Truman, the vice president, who was playing the piano. We were rather embarrassed about that because he didn't seem to be awfully good on the piano. And we didn't know that he was going to be a great president, you see.
I see.
And it didn't look as though he did either, as a matter of fact. But he and myself, there were only about 4 or 5 civilians. All the rest were tremendous brass, dripping with gold, braid and medals and everything else. And it was in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. And a door opened. And GI, more innocent looking than anything you could possibly imagine and younger than anything you could dream of, stuck his head in. At the moment when General Marshall happened to look toward the door, and the boy looked at him, he said, "Gee, General Marshall, can I come in and say hello to you?" Marshall said, "Yeah, come in." And Marshall didn't know anybody was watching. This wasn't a grandstand play. I was in a position, my camera was angled, so he didn't know he was getting photographed in anybody's film of memory.
Yeah.
And he took the boy aside, away from everybody, and sat down with him. And I heard as he went that the boy had been away from home. And the boy recognized Marshall as somebody like a family. Now, this was the commander of all the Allied forces. And he sat with this boy without any grandstanding at all, and just put him at ease and made him feel at home again for half an hour and left all the rest of us. He was that kind of fellow.
I wonder what the difference is between a man like that and the ones who are impressive publicly but couldn't be bothered to talk to anyone that isn't important to them or flattering.
Well, I don't know. Those kind of people are all second-rate, who can't be bothered at all, ever. Yeah. But there are those who can't be bothered sometimes. You know, and that's... You had a feeling with Marshall that if it were possible to be bothered, he would let himself be bothered. Yeah. He was a tremendous gentleman, you know, an old-fashioned institution which isn't with us anymore.
You almost never want to ask anyone the question who's impressed you the most, and it's wonderful to have a guest who can give you the answer.
Well, I never do know the answers to those kind of
They're
questions,
hard, aren't they?
You know, but I just happen to know that one. Yeah. Of course, I was immensely impressed with Churchill, but he was quite another thing, you know. He had great humor and great irony. He went to see me when I played Othello on the stage in London, and I heard a low murmuring in the front row. I thought he was talking to himself, and then he came backstage afterwards and sat down in the dressing room and said, "Most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my most approved good masters," and began the whole of Othello's part, which he had memorized, and including the cuts which I had made. which he read with a good deal of extra emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few years afterwards, I happened to be in Venice trying to get some money for a movie during the festival, and poor Churchill had been, right after the war, as you know, crest of the greatest victory that any single man had ever presided over in modern history, was voted out of office. Quite properly, probably, but it was a tragic blow for him. And there he was in the hotel at the Lido with Clemmy, his wife, alone. And he'd go swimming out on the beach. And one day at lunch, I came in with a Russian businessman I was trying to hustle for some money for this picture. And as we passed Mr. Churchill's table, Mr. Churchill saw me and made that little gesture, and the Russian went out of his mind. This is a white Russian, not a red Russian. This is a you know, a hustling semi-Armenian Russian. And when he saw that Mr. Churchill not only knew me, but gave a rather special acknowledgement, it was clear to me that I had the money for my picture. So the next morning I was out swimming in the beach, and I found myself paddling in the water right next to Mr. Churchill. And I hadn't gone up to speak to him, but there we were in the water, and I had known him on and off during the war in a humble capacity, and I said, and he had come backstage to see me, and I said, Mr. Churchill, I think you ought to know what you did for me. And I told him about how this acknowledgement had meant so much to me with my financier. And that day at lunch, I came in with a financier again, and Mr. Churchill rose from his chair and bowed.